Dr. Gilbert, what work were you asked to do in connection with this case?
So I was asked to review medical records, radiographs, pictures, as well as testimonies and depositions related to Mr. Depp's finger injury.
Okay. And to your understanding, what is Mr. Depp's explanation of how his finger was injured?
He describes that he was in Australia and his right hand was over the side of a bar when a vodka bottle was thrown at his hand, injuring his right middle finger. And he describes that the vodka bottle exploded.
Are you aware of other explanations for that injury?
There have been multiple other explanations, but I think the one that was brought out was by Ms. Hurd, who believed that Mr. Depp was holding a landline and out of anger was punching it against the wall, and this resulted in his right middle finger injury.
Based on your review of the medical records and other documents in connection with Mr. Depp's finger injury, how would you describe the nature of the injury to Mr. Depp's finger?
Well, the nature of the injury was he had what we describe as a comminuted fracture of the distal phalanx, meaning there was a fracture of the tip of the finger, and comminuted meaning that there were multiple pieces. So this is some type of blunt force with a high mechanism of injury. He also sustained loss of the tissue along what's called the ulnar side of the finger towards the little finger. And this appeared, based upon my review of the pictures, to be some type of sharp laceration because it represented a clean edges of the wound.
Can we take a look at Plaintiff's Exhibit 60? And pull up to go to page 3. And Dr. Gilbert, are you familiar with this document?
Yes.
And what is it?
So these are two radiographs, x-rays of Mr. Depp's finger, his middle finger.
Okay. Sorry, just to stop you, but Your Honor, may we publish this to the jury as a demonstrative?
Any objection? All right, we'll identify it as 60, page 3, and publish to the jury.
And Dr. Gilbert, sorry to cut you off there. Can you just tell the jury what we're looking at here in this X-ray?
Two X-rays of Mr. Depp's right middle finger after the injury, and towards the tip of the finger, there's a fracture. Again, what I described as a comminuted fracture, meaning there are multiple pieces at the tip. There's also a transverse component to the fracture closer to the joint.
In your view, what types of mechanisms can cause this sort of injury?
So this is a mechanism of injury that has high velocity or force, generally a crush type injury. A simple fall would not result in a comminuted fracture such as is seen in these x-rays.
And we're using the term comminuted fracture. Can we just define that quickly for us?
So again, comminuted, and it's not particular to a finger, is a medical term for a fracture that has multiple fragments.
In your opinion, could this injury have been sustained in the manner Mr. Depp described?
I do believe so.
And how might that work? How might a thrown vodka bottle produce an injury like this?
So a vodka bottle, which is a hard object, would have crushed the tip of the finger, resulting in the comminuted fracture. And in addition, as the vodka bottle broke, the glass would have lacerated the finger, resulting in the soft tissue loss that was also seen with this injury.
What's your assessment of the description of the cause of the injury offered by Ms. Hurd?
I think that's highly unlikely.
And why is that?
Because in general, when an injury is caused by punching against a wall or a hard object, it is extremely rare to see an injury to the tips of the fingers, which is seen with Mr. Depp's injury. Generally, you're holding something with a fist, and that in general leads to injuries most commonly of the knuckles here, or fractures of the metacarpals. We call these boxer fractures. Second most common after those would be injuries to these, but as you can see, if you're holding something and hitting against something, it is very unlikely that the tips of the fingers will be injured. In addition, just taking into account the radiographs and the pictures of the injury, I would not believe that solely a blunt force against a wall would result in the soft tissue loss.
What other injuries, if any, would you expect to see on Mr. Depp's hand if the injury had occurred as Ms. Hurd described?
So if that were the cause of the injury, you would certainly, that would be a dorsally directed, so this is a dorsal in the back of the hand as opposed to the palmar side. So if you're punching against something, you would certainly expect an injury to the nail bed, and those are always seen in those type of injuries. If there is an injury to the tip of the finger, which again I said is rare. So you would see either a loss of the nail or blood underneath the nail called a subungual hematoma.
In your review of the medical records, did you see any sign of anything like that?
None whatsoever.
In your view, is the injury, can you explain to us exactly why you think the injury is consistent with Mr. Depp's description?
Well, again, his hand, he describes his hand being held over a marble bar, which is a firm, something firm, unyielding, and the bottle hit against the finger. So basically the finger was crushed, resulting in, again, what I described as a comminuted fracture. And as Mr. Depp described, the bottle exploded, so it's certainly reasonable that the glass that exploded as well led to the soft tissue loss along the ulnar aspect of his finger.
Now, did you observe the testimony of Dr. Richard Moore?
Yes, I did.
And he testified about Mr. Depp's finger injury as well?
Correct.
Right. Did you agree with Dr. Moore's testimony?
Certain parts of his testimony I did, yes,
Okay.
but not all of it.
Focusing on the parts that well, first of all, why don't you tell us what you agree on?
Well, I agreed in terms of his interpretation of the x-rays, saying that he had a comminuted fracture and this was some type of high force injury.
Okay. What did you disagree with?
Well, I disagreed with several things that he said. He first said that he does not believe that the mechanism of injury could be, as described by Mr. Depp, holding the hand on the side of a marble bar, because he said it was all a palmar injury, and there was a palmar component to the injury. I'm talking about the soft tissue loss, but there was also a dorsal, meaning the back of the finger. So the soft tissue loss was actually, if you looked at the pictures which were shown when Dr. Moore testified, the injury goes like this. So it's an angled or an oblique type injury. And there's no way that anybody could determine whether or not it was a palmar directed force, meaning from the palm side, or dorsally directed force. But certainly either are plausible.
Okay. Anything else come to mind that you disagreed with?
Well, he also described that this was definite. Well, he thought that this was a pinching, or what he described as an avulsion type injury, and that's referring to the soft tissue loss. That's certainly possible, but if you look at the pictures that were shown when he testified, the laceration looked fairly clean. There were clean edges. It was not jagged. And generally, when you have an avulsion or a pinch type injury, you see a very irregular border to the skin. It's pinched off, you can imagine, as opposed to something that's cleaner that would be lacerated by, let's just say, a piece of glass or a knife or whatever. And that's more consistent with the pictures of Mr. Depp's injury.
And we're using the term soft tissue loss, and just to make sure we're on the same page, can you just tell very quickly what you're referring to there?
Right, so there were two components to this injury. One, the fracture of the bone, and two, he had loss of the soft tissues so that the bone was exposed. So that amputated part that was found at the bar.
Now, you were saying that Dr. Moore testified that this was an avulsion, and meaning a pinching injury, right?
Correct.
Why do you believe it's more likely that it was a laceration?
Well, again, in general, a pinch-type injury results in, one, much more damage to the remaining tissue, but the remaining tissue is usually very irregular. The borders are jagged, and that's not what was depicted in the pictures.
Dr. Moore also testified that he thought a vodka bottle might not have sufficient force to cause the injury here. Is that your understanding of his testimony?
Correct.
What's your response to that?
I certainly believe that a vodka bottle that was thrown from a distance against a hand that was resting on a marble bar is more than sufficient force to result in this fracture and soft tissue loss.
Now, in looking at the medical records and the pictures of Mr. Depp's hand, what was the condition of his nail?
There was no injury to the nail.
And other than what you've already told us, how does that factor into your analysis, if at all? The fact that there was no injury to the nail?
Well, it makes it highly unlikely that the mechanism of injury described by Ms. Heard resulted in this injury, because you really would always see an injury to the nail and or nail bed.
Do you have any opinion regarding the direction of the injury?
Well, it's certainly based upon the soft tissue loss. It's an angled injury, or what we call medically an oblique injury, because the soft tissue loss is at an angle. He lost some of the tissue on the back of the finger as well as the palm side, primarily along the palm side. But other than that, you can't make any assumptions. Unless you saw a videotape of this injury, nobody could tell you definitively what the direction of the injury was.
Dr. Moore also commented on the absence of fragments of broken glass in Mr. Depp's injury. Do you remember that?
Yes, I do.
And how does the absence of glass fragments factor into your analysis?
It really doesn't. I've seen hundreds, if not probably at least 500 or more glass injuries, and I would say probably the majority you don't see glass in these injuries. It is much more common to see glass embedded in the wounds when you're talking about very fine glass. So if just say a wine glass would explode or something of that nature, where you get little tiny shards. But in general, when you have thick glass, such as you see in a bottle, or a pane of glass, you generally don't see, because they break into bigger pieces, and you generally don't see the glass. But you certainly can, but it's not surprising that you don't.